Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm now going to talk to you a little bit about network theory, which is, of course, a way of thinking about the world which is applied in all kinds of different areas of study, whether it's in medicine and looking at how epidemics spread, or looking at the World Wide Web, and a million other ways. But there are actually many ways in which network theory can be applied to economics. And so, while I will be using examples from other fields, you will see that there are many ways in which they cross over back and forth, and there are analogies that are interesting. And of course, when one is studying economics, one has to realize that it is, of course, a world in which everything is interconnected. In fact, that is precisely the point about network theory. So what really is network theory all about? In order to understand that, you need to first understand how traditional economics views economic agents and the way they respond to the world. Now, in traditional economics, essentially economic agents are seen as isolated individuals who are swimming about in this world of perfect information and making rational choices responding to that perfect information. But in fact, as we discussed in an earlier lecture in this series, we actually live in a complex world with imperfect information where the world is continuously changing. And in addition to that, individuals do not function, not just individuals as persons, but also economic agents of all kinds, whether it's policymakers, institutions, and so on. They all function as a part of networks. So in this lecture, what I'm going to talk about is how thinking about the world in terms of networks makes a very big difference in how we understand the world. Now, network theory basically talks about structures which are made up of large numbers of agents and components. Network theorists very often call them vertices or nodes, and they are connected to each other in multiple ways. We call them links or edges. And of course, as with any complex system, these links can change, evolve, and move around, and they have all kinds of implications. Now, examples of such networks include social networks. Many of you will be part of such social networks. There will be family, friends, professional networks, and so on. There are information networks. For example, the internet. There are infrastructure networks like power grid, transport system. There are economic networks like international trade. There is financial systems. And of course, there are other kinds of linkages such as epidemics and pandemics. So what are the characteristics of a network? Well, first of all, the most important thing to know about networks is, of course, that they are made up of nodes and connections. That's obvious. But what is important to know about network theory is that, except in special circumstances, these nodes and connections vary in size and scale. So two different nodes don't have to be identical. One may be much bigger node than another. The thickness of their relationship may vary between different nodes, and so on. Second thing to remember, that these nodes are not static. They can grow, they can evolve in multiple different ways. Similarly, pathways between the nodes impact the way they interact. So in a traditional economic world, basically, even if you think about interactions, they tend to be by and large equal in various ways between all people in the system. Whereas in a networked world, what matters is how individuals are linked to each other, and these may be very peculiar networks between them. So it matters where in the network you are, how connected you are to others in the network. You're not just sort of isolated individuals swimming about, as I said, in this world of perfect information. Then, of course, there are the issues about what kind of pathways exist. Some pathways are more efficient, and some may be more thicker. There may be actually different pathways between the same two nodes. Then, of course, a very important thing about networks is that not all nodes are equal. So some nodes may be disproportionately big and have disproportionately big impacts, therefore, on the whole system. And one of the implications which is obvious is that therefore there are increasing returns to scale from this, both positive returns to scale and negative returns to scale. Basically, there are huge feedback loops, and of course, as a network becomes more and more important, its impact on the wider system grows by a power law, as we will come to. And then, of course, the obvious implication of all of this is that these pathways can lead to contagion and spillover effects. And of course, the last point is, it is very interesting how completely different fields may have networks which have very similar structures, which of course allows us to use analogies and modeling from different fields to apply to each other. Now, one of the big innovators in this field is a gentleman called Barabási. He's a mathematician, and he and his colleagues mapped out a portion of the World Wide Web and basically found that that in certain kinds of networks, which we call ScaleFree networks, you have these power laws, which is basically that certain nodes and hubs in these networks become simply disproportionately important, and they enjoy all kinds of increasing returns to scale and feedback loops that make them ever more powerful. And so you see that with urban hubs, you see that with airports, economics systems, etc., where you have these disproportionately important hubs. And of course, there are many examples of this, as I said, internet networks, citation networks, air traffic networks, and so on. And here is just one example of a scale-free network. This is the airport network in India and the flights and connections there are between them. As you can see, this network, the air network in India, is not evenly spread out. There are obviously certain nodes that are just simply much more important. Delhi, Mumbai clearly are much more important, but some of the other large cities like Kolkata, Chennai, etc. And then there are much less important networks like, say, Raipur, which only is connected to two other networks in this. There may be some which are just connected to one. And so, as you can see, this is an example of a scale-free network in an infrastructure environment. Now, the question then arises, why does thinking about the world as a series of networks make a difference about how we understand the world? And so, here is an example taken from the medical world about how epidemics spread through systems, through contagion.
Today, planes can transport viruses to any country on the globe in a fraction of the time it took in 1918. In February 2003, for instance, a Chinese doctor arrived at the Metropole Hotel in Hong Kong feeling unwell. Unknown to him, he was harboring a new animal origin virus called SARS, short for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome. Within 24 hours of checking into room 913, 16 other guests had been infected, and over the following days, 5 boarded planes to overseas destinations, spreading the virus to Vietnam, Singapore, and Canada. Flights between Hong Kong, Toronto, and other international cities were quickly grounded, and thanks to other emergency measures, a pandemic was averted. By the time the outbreak was over 4 months later, SARS had infected 29 countries worldwide, and more than 1,000 people were dead. For all that the virus was rapidly contained, however, there was little that could be done about the alarming news reports carried by cable news channels and the internet. As bloggers added to the hysteria by spreading unfounded conspiracy theories, tourism in Hong Kong and other affected cities ground to a halt, costing businesses more than $10 billion. One business, however, did very well. Above all, SARS was a reminder that pandemics have always been associated with panic. If history teaches us anything, it is that while pandemics may start small, their impacts can be as dramatic as wars and natural disasters. The difference today is that science gives us the ability to detect pandemics right at the very beginning and to take action to mitigate their impacts before they spread too widely.
The example that we have used is from the SARS episode that we had in 2003 in East Asia, and how it was found that a single individual who got infected landed in an airport, checked into a hotel, and then began to rapidly infect others in the system. And very soon this contagion began to spread. Of course, we live in an interconnected world. People fly to other places. They infect people while traveling in the aircraft, the others in the aircraft, and they land in another city where they infect others, then those people infect other people, and so on and so forth. And so very quickly, SARS, which really started with basically, as far as we can tell, with just one individual being infected, ended up spreading all over the world. Now, here is another example of such a system. This is an episode which is similar to the SARS episode. This is the H1N1 epidemic, which also spread from East Asia and then ended up traveling all over the world. Here we have used a map to show you how it works. Now, as you will see, it starts very, very small. I mean, in fact, when it starts, as you will see, you can barely see where it starts from. But as you will see, as it progresses, it then crisscrosses the world, ends up in other nodes. From those nodes, it just spreads in a multiplier sort of effect. And notice, it is not spreading in the way you would expect in traditional ways, that there is a certain hub from where there is slow diffusion outward. Far from it, it jumps from one hub to another hub, and from that hub into where the connections of that hub are. This is consequently, if you see the geographical spread of this, is completely driven by how the network works, rather than how the geographical location of the place really is. It's about interconnectedness, not about simply looking at the distance from the source. So far, you have seen how these network effects happen with epidemics. But in fact, very similar logic even applies for, say, a financial contagion. Notice the word contagion is being used here as well, and for good reason, because essentially the logic with these things, a financial contagion spreads during a financial crisis, suffers pretty much exactly the same kind of logic. And we saw that, of course, in 2007-8 when you had the global financial crisis, and of course the interconnectedness of financial systems had an enormous effect on how things spread around the world very, very quickly, particularly after the collapse of Lehman Brothers. So here is a very simple graphic representation of how all these major financial institutions were connected to each other. Now remember, this is a simplification. There were many other agents here, connections. These are just connections within the US to other large institutions. There were other hedge funds, smaller funds of various kinds, connected through to other parts of the world, in Europe, in Asia, and so on. But even this very simple graphic representation shows you how various linkages happen, and consequently, when one of the nodes in this begins to break down, it very quickly begins to spread through to others. Now, look at how different this view is to how most static economic modeling works. In fact, one of the reasons this system breakdown happened so quickly was because, in fact, the way most of the banks used to manage their risk was as if they were isolated beings. So since they were thinking of themselves as isolated beings, and their risk management systems had been set up as if the shocks to the system were somehow followed some sort of a Gaussian normal distribution, rather than taking into account that this spreading would actually cause the rest of the system to also break down, means that they hadn't taken into account the various kinds of network and feedback loops that you should expect. Now, one thing for all economists to remember, given this experience, is that in a network world, there is no such thing as ceteris paribus. Now, of course, we have other episodes like this as well. Very more recently in India, you had several financial stresses happening in the system. And again, here is a representation of how India's financial system is interlinked. You have banks, you have insurance, you have NBFCs, and all kinds of other groups. And in this networked world, clearly, if one financial institution, for whatever reason, is in trouble, the problem will very quickly begin to spread. Again, notice very similar to how we think about medical epidemics. The solution, interestingly, can also consequently have similarities. How do we control a rapid spreading of a epidemic? Well, one way is to do a quarantine. And in fact, in the particular episode, when we had this similar episode in September, October of 2018, in the financial system, we had effectively one institution, ILNFS, which seemed to be particularly vulnerable and was likely to have a large contagion through the system. So what was done? Well, it was put in quarantine. The government acted very quickly and ring-fenced it in multiple ways, effectively mimicking the idea of a quarantine in a medical situation, and consequently was able to limit, not entirely eliminate, but limit some of the financial contagion that may have happened if such a large institution had gone under. Now, not only bad things like epidemics and financial contagion spread through networks, good things can also spread through networks. Ideas spread through networks as well. And so we have many examples of how ideas spread. The internet, particularly in a world of blogs and social media, is an obvious place where ideas will spread very, very quickly. It's a world we are all very familiar with. But again, note how networks matter. There is a idea at the back of many people's minds, perhaps, that political views, for example, may be following some sort of a normal distribution, where there are some people with very extreme views, and there is one single mode in the middle where so-called centrists, most of the centrists are sitting around. And the idea was that in a very highly networked world, this center would in fact dominate everybody else. In fact, if you go back to the early years of social media, many of those who were promoting their social media network like Facebook, Twitter, and so on, would make the case that, oh, this is going to become, we were all going to live in a world that was going to be a better place because everybody could share ideas, etc. But in fact, what we found is quite interesting, that rather than thinking of individuals, i.e. those participating in the social media or in blogs, as being isolated individuals, we find that instead they were actually linking themselves through to various networks. And very quickly, these networks began to dominate any other pre-existing system that may or may not have ever existed. And here is what happens in the area of blogs. This was mapped out by researchers in around about 2005, which is, of course, when all of this was really taking over. This is about a little less than 1,500 blogs that were taken from the US, and then they were plotted according to how conservative and liberal they were. And as they were being plotted, and of course their linkages were being mapped out, this is what we found. As you can see, on one side, the red are the more conservative oriented blogs, and in the blue, you have the more liberal oriented blogs. And of course, there is some extremes lying outliers, but you can see there are these two huge blogs. And so, you can see there are also links between them, of course, so there are people who talk to each other, but for the most part, what you have is conservative, i.e. Republican leaning blogs essentially linked to each other, and you have liberal, i.e. Democrat leaning blogs linked to each other. and there is really very little talking between the two. Effectively, what you have is a world of echo chambers, very different from the original idea that political views tend to follow some sort of a single modal normal distribution. Similar idea can also be shown through looking at a analysis of Twitter. This is a more recent study, and again what was done here was to take certain hashtags. So this is all about climate change. So there were 3 hashtags that were studied. One was called hashtag climate change, the other is hashtag global warming, and hashtag AGW. You have 2 groups of people. One is the activist types, typically who tend to be who are climate change activists, so they are believers, and then there are the climate change skeptics, let's call them the unbelievers. And what happens then is we find that they tend not only to not agree with each other, link to each other, but they tend to use a certain kinds of hashtags in more than others. So for example, if the hashtag climate change was being used, it is almost entirely used by climate change believers or activists, and you can see them in green in the first of these maps. There are a few of the skeptics who also come across, but by and large it is the activists. Then supposing you talk about global warming, you do have some activists, but you also have some skeptics who use this hashtag, but you can again see as followers of each other how they are all linked. They are clearly bunched separately. The activists follow each other and the skeptics also follow each other, although there are a few who kind of follow sort of cross each other. And then finally you have the hashtag AGW. This seems to be somewhat more popular with the skeptics, and you can see there's a huge blob of them there. Again, they seem to be all by and large following each other, although there are some links back and forth as well. But you can again see clearly echo chambers in climate change discussion. I am sure they have both very good points to be made, but they do not talk to each other. Now, organizational hierarchy also has a very interesting impact on information hierarchies. But interestingly, organization hierarchies in a system and information hierarchies in a system do not necessarily match each other. And when they do match each other, it may not be necessarily a good thing. So let me give you one example here. This was a study done of a Hungarian company some years ago, which had a peculiar problem. This was a large Hungarian company with offices and agents all across the country. And this company found that it had a peculiar problem, that although the management was making a great amount of effort to send out certain information, ideas, practices and company policies out into the field, in fact it had almost no impact on the behavior on the ground. So they decided to do something quite interesting. They hired a bunch of researchers to go to each of these workers inside the organization and ask them who is it that they rely on most for advice or ideas and so on about what to do in a particular professional situation. So who would they go to? And therefore what the idea was to see how these company employees were essentially getting their behavioral patterns and where did they get ideas and thoughts about company policy. So here is a map of this. There is a group right somewhere in the middle of a small network. You will see, I think it's in orange if I am not mistaken, on the left hand map, and they are actually the managers, and as you can very quickly see that they are not necessarily in the information hierarchy of the system the biggest hubs. So this is a map, again let me point out, this is a map of the information hierarchy of the organization, and it, as you can see, does not map with the organizational hierarchy. Instead, they found that there were a few individuals in the system who disproportionately seemed to be influencing people across the network with ideas. But they were clearly not a part of the organizational hierarchy. So when they began to research who this person was, or these persons were, they found that the most important person in the entire organization in terms of the information hierarchy was in fact the environment and safety officer. Now the environment and safety officer was, because of the nature of his job, going all across the organization and meeting people, particularly at the bottom. He was talking to them, he was maybe sharing gossip, sharing ideas. And it turned out that the whole system, at least those at the bottom of the hierarchy, trusted him a lot. And so it was from him that they were getting many of the ideas about what company policy was really about. But because the safety and environment officer wasn't particularly important in the organizational hierarchy of this company, nobody in the directors and senior management of this company thought it particularly important to educate him about how company policies were supposed to be. So this rather innocuous person in the system was going around spreading whatever he thought was company policy, and that effectively was influencing how everybody believed. Now clearly, if you were a clever manager, what would you do? You would actually pick up such individuals. In this particular case happens to be the safety and environment officer, and educate this person on what it is that you wanted to do, because he was the most likely person to spread your ideas very, very quickly through the organization, even though in the company hierarchy he may not have a particularly important role. Now, here is another example of how hierarchies work in networks. This is an example of very often something many of you may have experienced in large organizations. Very often this happens, whether it's a government or maybe even in large corporations. You'll have a meeting with in a room with a long long conference table, and officials will be sitting on both sides of this, and there will be a senior person, say the chairman, who sits at the top. Now notice from this how the information hierarchy is functioning. Here the information hierarchy and the organizational hierarchy completely coincide. So unlike in the previous example, here it completely coincides. The chairman tells everybody what to do, and if he needs an answer, those people answer directly back to him. They are not talking to each other. Now, certain situations, this may be a good thing. Let's say, for example, in a military emergency, the boss tells everybody what to do, they all understand what to do, and they do it. But it may not be the best way to run an organization because very often there is no exchanging of ideas. The boss tells everybody what to do. And there may be there is no networking of the kind that we saw in the earlier example. So this particular network has solved the problem of the previous network that we saw, but on the other hand, there is absolutely no exchanging of ideas. So if, for example, the chairman makes a major blunder, there is no feedback loop in the system that will stop it from being carried out, and consequently in this particular network you have very high key man risk. Now, there is another kind of networking that depends very often on how various nodes are linked, and that happens to be in the case of cities. This is important to understand. You see, very often we think of cities as basically agglomerations of real estate, the houses, buildings, and so on. But you have to remember, ultimately, cities are not about the buildings or the infrastructure. They are about networks of people. It's agglomerations of people. And at the beginning of the 1990s, many people thought that it would be the case that now that we had this mobile telephony and networks of internet and so on coming through, that these networks of people could in fact be maintained by simply using email or phones and so on, and now there would be no particular need to live in a large expensive city, because after all, if you wanted to talk to anybody in the world, you could quite easily send them an email. Why would you bother to live in an expensive city and suffer the traffic jams? It turns out, however, that not only are networks important, but their random evolving nature is also very important. And such is the importance of these random evolving networks that cities have actually become even more successful in the 21st century after the introduction of internet and other things that you would have thought would have actually killed cities. So if you go back to, say, the North America, you have cities like New York, which were actually in decline till the early 90s, have actually come back. Manhattan is today more buzzing than it has ever been in its history. Tokyo is still a growing city at 37 million population. Delhi is 28 million if you take the entire ecosystem of the NCR into account. Shanghai has 25 million. These are huge cities, and yet they are still growing. Now notice how completely different it is from thinking about the static way of traditional economics. In traditional economics, the idea was, yes, there is some gain from agglomeration and economies of scale, but at the same time, there is marginal returns because at some point in time, those agglomeration benefits begin to diminish. But on the other hand, the cost of congestion begins to go up, and at the point at which the agglomeration benefits and the cost of contagion cross each other, that's where you have the equilibrium level of urbanization. That indeed is not what is happening. As I said, Tokyo, which has 37 million people in a country where population is declining, is still growing. So suggesting that these networking effects are not just small, they actually overwhelm everything, including the cost of congestion, to such an extent that even at 37 million, Tokyo keeps growing. Look at these numbers. You have Shanghai and Delhi, as you can see, they have been continuously growing since the 1990s. Every economic model of the early 90s would have told you that these cities shouldn't be growing because, well, you know, the static networks, even to the extent that they thought of networks, would now function on the internet. But in fact, the randomized nature of interaction, in fact, overrides this the costs of congestion. Tokyo, as you can see, is still growing. But by the way, this works backwards as well. So when this process of networks begin to break down, they can continuously keep breaking down even when the city is depopulating. And an example of this is Detroit. If you took the traditional idea, then as Detroit began to lose people, of course it became less congested, the cost of real estate would keep falling, and there would be some equilibrium at which people would continue to live in Detroit. But in fact, that's not what happened. Since the 1960s, the city has been continuously losing people, and by the 1980s, it had already lost a large part of its population, as well as its traditional automobile industry. But look at what keeps happening. It continuously loses people to an extent that there are now large depopulated parts of Detroit where real estate price is effectively zero, and yet people still don't want to move in there. Why? Because as the system begins to break down, it has the same effect, the network effect that had caused cities to grow. As they break down, that means that it also has increasing increasing returns to scale works backwards. So therefore you have this vicious cycle that works against you, and it doesn't matter. You can keep getting cheaper and cheaper, and all the traditional factors that you would think would stabilize it come into play, but it still doesn't matter because this network, the reverse network effect, also breaks through all traditional economics. Now let me show you what I'm talking about by illustrating it on a map. Here is Manhattan, the city that I told you about, that till the early 90s was in fact in severe decline. Manhattan, as you know, is of course only a small part of the city of New York, but it's an important part. It's an expensive place to be, and yet it has, in this post-networked world, it has actually done very, very well. Why has it done so well? Well, because networks are not just about the rigid networks that you have pre-existing, thanks to maybe the pre-existing set of friends that you may have, or who you may know how to interact with on email. It's not about the pre-existing sets of things that you do. It's about the agglomeration and the random interactions. And randomized interactions happen beautifully in successful cities. And the reason I've given this map is to show you how this works. Here is southern Manhattan. In southern Manhattan, you have all kinds of different things. You have, for example, Wall Street right at the southern tip. This is the financial hub. Not so far away is all the Meat District and all the other areas that have relatively recently become cool places to hang out. There are bars, restaurants, and clubs and other things in this area. Not so far away, there is, of course, New York University that has brought alive Washington Square and that area. And a little further up, there is Midtown. There are large numbers of museums there. There's, of course, Empire State Building. And what is interesting is, as you go up, there is also mixing through with nice residential places. There is, of course, Central Park, and a whole bunch of mix and match of things to do. It is the mix and match of all these. So this is a network in an urban landscape of all kinds of different things. And this brings together a urban landscape that allows this randomized networking ecosystem to function and brings enormous value. I mean, Manhattan, as I said, is extremely successful as an urban landscape. It is a very expensive place to live. Many of the people who live in Manhattan can quite easily afford to live in a large mansion somewhere in the suburbs, but continue to be willing to live here and pay a high rent. Why? Because this networking effect has such a large economic and social value. Now, in the specific case of Manhattan, of course, some part of at least of this has evolved organically. One may ask, what implication does this sort of way of thinking have for urban policy? Well, let me show you. This is the middle of Singapore. You can see right up in front is the financial district. Further out you can see a little green patch, that's the Singapore Cricket Club, but right next to it is the National Gallery. On the right you have the Esplanade Theatre Complex, and then you have Singapore Management University, then Suntec City, and so on. Now, what is interesting about much of this is that other than the Singapore Cricket Club, most of this has actually been built in recent times. And the reason many of these things have been built so close to each other, in fact, very, very within walking distance of each other, is because of this idea that this networking effect is so powerful that in fact you need to mix and match all kinds of different institutions in a very small distance in order to create this networking agglomeration effect. So you have all kinds of things in this very, very tiny area, which may seem not to be connected to each other, but in fact you see that all over the world. Where if you take, for example, London into account, the East End of London has some great theatre. It also has the City of London and the financial district. It also has London School of Economics. The same sort of logic works, but here in the case of Singapore, you can see that this is actually being deliberately engineered in a city that is relatively modern, and they didn't have this whole ecosystem evolve organically. It had to be actually thought about and built, and very successfully so. Singapore Management University is barely 15 years old, and yet it is considered amongst the world's top management universities. And what is interesting, that even in a city with, where real estate is very, very expensive, look at where this new university was built. This is Singapore Management University, built in some of the most expensive real estate in the country, bang in the middle of the city, but within walking distance of important museums, walking distance of the financial district. So why was it built here? Basically for networking effects, to bring young people to the middle of the city, within range of where their prospective employers are likely to be, which is in the financial district, but also in and around all kinds of other activities, whether it is the theatre life. There's also scattered in there residential areas. So there is some historic sites. So Singapore has very few historical sites, but to the extent they has, of course, a very well-known hotel, the Raffles Hotel, chimes and so on. It's all bunched up together, mixing and matching, networking, allowing for all kinds of interconnections. This is what was deliberately done rather than build out a large campus somewhere away from the city center where maybe they would have had more space but would have missed this networking. Now, look at how different this is from how Indians build new universities. I want to give here the example of Jodhpur and IIT. But this is true of pretty much every new institution that we have built in post-independence India. Whenever a new university is, or IIT or large institution is built in India, it's very, very common to go out there and acquire a large campus, maybe hundreds of acres. In fact, success is very often measured in terms of how many 100 acres was acquired for a particular campus. And then it is, because it's only possible to acquire such a large chunk of land somewhere far away from the city, so these tend to be quite away from a major urban hub. And then this campus is then completely walled off from the host city. Now, this is kind of completely different from how you could see the Singaporeans were thinking about their new university. And as a result of this Indian thinking process, you have a strange situation. But even when these institutes become well established, there is almost no linkage to their host city. So that's why Kanpur, for example, benefits nothing from hosting an IIT. Kharagpur has no benefit from hosting IIT Kharagpur. Contrast that to Boston, which benefits enormously from the fact that MIT and Harvard and Boston University, all of which, by the way, are within walking distance of each other, are all mixing and matching and interacting with the city. Because we are not thinking of this as a network. We are thinking of this in a siloed system, i.e. a walled system which does not connect through to the rest of the world. And I will show you even more starkly how this looks. This is IIT Jodhpur. It's 852-acre campus. It has a student enrollment as of 2019, I'm told, of just 247. Why is it that building this kind of a university with lots of space isn't such a great idea? Well, let me show you how this doesn't work. Well, think about it like this. You have built all this large campus, but in fact, think about the faculty that you will now get here. The idea here is somehow that you will get good faculty that will come and live here, presumably with large campus, you'll get nice large housing, but you're not thinking about what their family will do, what will their spouse or children do. We don't live anymore in a world where the factory worker goes to the factory to work and his wife stays at home, darns the socks, and the children go to the factory school and so on. Even if that environment ever existed, it certainly isn't the way the world exists today. So if an IIT like Jodhpur had to attract talent, it would have a real problem because the spouses of all the staff would have effectively be marooned in the middle of nowhere. Similarly, the students, other than the time they spend in studying, they would have absolutely nothing to do and almost no correlation, no linkage through to this city that is their host. It would have been far more sensible to build a smaller, more compact, but more integrated campus closer to the city. That would have been good not only for the city of Jodhpur, which would now have a young population which is moving around the city, but it would also be very good for the IIT, which would then actually have some back and forth linkages with the real world rather than living cocooned in this particular way. And by the way, this continues to happen even if the city evolved, if ever Jodhpur grew so big as to be able to reach these many kilometers away to their campus, it would still not be a benefit. And you see that with IIT Delhi, which happens to be marooned now in the middle of the Delhi city, but has almost no connection with the real urban lived life of the city. So what have we learned from this way of thinking about economics and the world? Well, first of all, networks and pathways of connection determine outcomes. They are important. We cannot think of siloed agents working in isolation. Second, an understanding of dynamic flows through a network cannot be replaced by any amount of static analysis. So how, for example, an epidemic spreads or a financial contagion spreads matters a great deal about how it is networked, not just about how that particular entity is in itself. Thirdly, some nodes are very important and disproportionately important. You see that now being taken into account in how we manage financial risk by the term that is you may have read in the newspaper called systemically important financial institutions. That is because some financial institutions, and sometimes they may not be the largest ones, are the ones that are linked most to the rest of the system, and consequently a problem in this particular node is likely to feed through very quickly to the others. Then, of course, there is the issue of increasing returns to scale and agglomeration from networks. So as a particular hub grows, it actually gains even more strength and therefore grows even larger. So there is an increasing returns to scale from networking. And as with all complex systems, no amount of optimizing a node in isolation can compensate for understanding what the linkages are of the overall system. And finally, there is no such thing as a ceteris paribus in a networked world. You cannot think of changing something in one bit without taking into account how it will affect the overall system. Thank you very much.